I have the awesome pleasure of delivering fantastic news today, especially if you're a Marvel fan, if you're a Spider-Man fan. Amazing Spider-Man under Zeb Wells with John Romita Jr. has not been a banner run for the character. In fact, I certainly have seen enough people say it's the worst run in Spider-Man history. I don't know that I exactly agree with that, but it's certainly among the worst runs in Spider-Man history. And I had some high hopes for it. You know, Zeb Wells was coming off Hellions, which I thought was badass. He's certainly worked with Spider-Man before. I was like, hey, maybe Zeb Wells is coming into his own. Maybe he's finally got to assert himself as somebody to pay attention to in comic books. It turned out that was not to be the case. This comic book series has been over-promising and under-delivering essentially since its inception, and we are at the end state. We are almost to the final arc. Zeb Wells is going to be leaving along with John Romita Jr. Now, it certainly didn't help that John Romita Jr., while still a talented artist, is certainly not in his prime anymore. When we've had like Ed McGuinness as a guest artist or Patrick Gleason, it certainly looked better, but certainly not good enough to save the story, which has been very lackluster from the very beginning. And don't worry, they're going to overpromise and underdeliver one last time on their way out the door. Writer Zeb Wells and artist John Romita Jr. will be concluding their run on Amazing Spider-Man with one final arc in which Peter Parker will take on Tombstone in a brawl to win it all, with Marvel billing it as Spidey's most brutal battle. We haven't heard anything like this before. Remember at the beginning? What did Peter do? Aunt May hates him, MJ hates him, the Fantastic Four hate him, Captain America doesn't even like Spider-Man anymore because there's an enormous explosion in Pittsburgh or in Pennsylvania somewhere. Turns out he didn't really do anything. The big reveal was MJ was trapped in like a pocket dimension and he had to use a piece of equipment that caused an explosion after he saved her, which he absolutely had to do because she was like aging faster than she would have in our world or something. She would have been an old woman if he didn't save her that very minute. And for some reason, MJ didn't like him anymore, I guess because she found Paul. Aunt May was just like, screw that guy. The Fantastic Four, like, I would never do anything like that. I would never use equipment to transfer over into another multiverse to save somebody. It was like the most Spider-Man thing in the history of the world to do, but they made a big deal out of it. The payoff was awful. And then what did we get? Zeb Wells was going to create the best version of Ben Reilly. He was no longer going to be in Spider-Man's shadow. He was going to be Chasm. And we were going to get a big event out of that. Turns out Chasm is just a knockoff of Venom. He even had the same exact motivation set as Venom, really, from the very beginning. The look of the character kind of looks like Venom. Not that it's a bad look, because Venom has a great look, but he even had some symbiote-type essence to him, even though he was not a symbiote. So that was an enormous letdown. Ben Reilly is still a wasted opportunity, a character that has not fully realized his potential, at least for the most part. There's been some good spots here and there, but I don't know. He didn't do anything cool with Ben Reilly, and that's certainly not a villain anyone cares about to this very day, even though Zeb Wells keeps trying to make Chasm a thing, and then we were going to get the big gang war. Oh, wait, no, before that, we were told that Zeb Wells was going to kill off a character, and it was going to be so controversial, so universally hated, that Marvel warned Zeb Wells, don't go to conventions, because the character that you're killing off at ASM would be so horrific that people would never forgive you. You're like, oh my goodness, he must be killing off MJ. The only character in Spider-Man besides Peter Parker that would elicit that type of reaction, it ended up being Miss Marvel. We all saw that one coming. As soon as she became a mutant in the TV show, she was going to be a mutant in the comic books, and they just stuffed it into Amazing Spider-Man for reasons unknown. Spider-Man Gang War is going to be a big event. Spider-Man is a passenger in his own event. He didn't even have really anything to do with the entire thing. He was just sitting there watching other people do stuff. And this entire ASM run has been Zeb Wells and Nick Lowe overpromising on stuff that no one cared about and underdelivering in the best way possible, where you're just like, oh, that was it. Nothing to get excited about, nothing to make you say anything new about Spider-Man. Apparently he had nothing interesting to say about Peter Parker or Spider-Man, and he's just been treading water for a couple of years now as the character languishes. Now people really turn to Ultimate Spider-Man for an alternative of an actual good Spider-Man. They really want Peter Parker with MJ, and now they're going to reboot it. But first, we're going to revisit the one thing that Zeb Wells has actually done well, at least in the beginning, in Amazing Spider-Man. Though Marvel's announcement doesn't specify how long the final arc will last, But we do know that it'll follow up Spider-Man and Tombstone's upcoming battle in Amazing Spider-Man 56, legacy numbering 850, and that Amazing Spider-Man 58 is being billed as the true kickoff of Wells and Romita's final arc. The rekindled rivalry between Tombstone and Spider-Man has been a long-running subplot in Wells' Amazing Spider-Man run. And in the beginning, it was truly the only standout story. And it remains that way. Although over time, as he continues to revisit the Tombstone elements and the plot that he's developed there and set up, he is making it worse over time, especially once you get into Gang War. But initially, that was the only thing that stood out as even being good. You know what? It's a fine story. Spider-Man versus Tombstone. John Romita Jr.'s art really fit Tombstone better than a lot of other villains at Spider-Man at this very moment. Not that he hasn't done great stuff in the past, but he's not quite the man or the artist that he used to be. And it was a high moment. Once you get into Spider-Man Gang War, and it's not really even about Tombstone anymore. Tombstone's like, I'm going to sit out. Wait, my daughter's in it. The Rose is taking over my gang, and she's fighting Madame Mask for control over New York. As Kingpin's just like, you know what? I don't think I can win against these two broads. I'm going to have to take a step back and quit fighting. And it was just like Spider-Man looking on a monitor being like, oh my goodness, the Taco Ninjas are battling for Manhattan while we've got the cybernetic tigers are controlling Brooklyn right now. What are we going to do? It was the most low stakes, lame-ass story in the history of the world. And then you had the marriage between Tombstone's daughter, Rose, and Robbie or whatever, which ended up with Tombstone being shot by a character I don't even remember who the guy is. I know that he shot him because Madame Mask made him do it or whatever, and they set up somebody else. Who did they set up? They set up somebody. It was so lame that I don't even remember at this point. I can't recall because the run's been so bad. But every time they try to revisit this Tombstone stuff, which is the only thing that has really worked throughout the entirety of the run, they make the Tombstone story less cool over time. And I imagine that will be the course right to the end. By the end, you'll be like, God, I wish he'd never done anything else with Tombstone after that first arc. But there are a lot of story elements that Zeb Wells will have to tie up before he leaves ASM. With the current arc of the title tying off some of Wells' other big plot lines, including the evolution of the living brain, the return of the Sinister Six, and Norman Osborn's fall from grace as the reborn Green Goblin, and even Ben Reilly's transformation in the villainous Chasm, it makes sense to tie off his time on the title this way. The best time to end Zeb Wells' Amazing Spider-Man run was probably before it began, and he actually pitched what he wanted to do with it. The second best time was a year in when you realized this is going nowhere fast. He had no payoffs for all the big stuff he was introducing. And now they're finally going to be like, yeah, I guess the fans were right. This really does suck. And it's only getting worse. Oh, my goodness. Within the last couple of issues, we got to see Peter Parker Spider-Man become Spider-Goblin. And this is truly when you knew it was over. You know, they're not going to let you sit there and flail and reach and grab and try to make something happen in your Amazing Spider-Man run like they let like Jason Aaron do in Avengers, where he did 4 or 5 things like Spider-Goblin at the end of his Avengers run, and none of them worked, and it just kind of sucked. They're not going to let you do that 4 or 5 times on ASM. It is the flagship book. It's very important. It is the #1 selling book. And once they brought out Spider-Goblin, which is basically the Batman Who Laughs, but with Spider-Man becoming the Green Goblin, you're like, yeah, they've got nothing else to do here. And then the living brain becomes the walking brain, and he looks exactly like Brainiac. He's just Brainiac from Superman, but he's in Spider-Man for reasons like we weren't going to notice it. Why do you call him the walking brain too? You couldn't give him a good name. The return of the Sinister Six has been bubbling, I guess, beneath the surface with the spear and all the sins of Norman Osborn that were being passed around like a time bicycle. The Winkler device changing Chasm and changing Spider-Man to implant whatever Norman Osborn was working on because he was never a good guy. I guess there was a reveal that Peter Parker never trusted him the entire time, but why even pretend like you do trust him? It was like, it's so weird. And then all of a sudden, Miss Marvel, despite being a mutant and supposedly being big in the X-Men books, is like talking to Norman Osborn. It's like, I know he's lying. I was testing him. It was like, what in the hell is going on here? And I don't know, the less said about Chasm, the better, and Hollow's Eve and Goblin Queen and every other stupid fucking thing introduced in Zeb Wells' Spider-Man run, which will truly go down as amongst the worst Spider-Man runs of all time. This will be talked about It will be in the debate for what is the worst Spider-Man run of all time. Zeb Wells Spider-Man will certainly be in the debate. Thankfully for John Romita Jr., he has a history of work on Spider-Man, and we know he's not the problem. It's clearly Zeb Wells, who had plenty of opportunities in the past with Spider-Man, but basically was never chosen until they ran out of people. There was nobody left to take on the Spider-Man, comic book, especially once Nick Spencer left abruptly for Substack, and he was the guy they chose, and he had an opportunity to make himself a big name, and obviously he's failed that in spectacular fashion. No pun intended, but I guess I accidentally got that one in there. Of course, there's one thing I think Zeb Wells' Spider-Man run will be remembered for more than anything. Not quite One More Day, not quite Sins Past, but certainly something that will live in infamy in the history of Amazing Spider-Man comic books. There's one other big running plotline in Wells' Amazing Spider-Man, the relationship between Mary Jane and her new boyfriend, Paul, and her separation from Peter Parker. It's a safe bet Wells won't end his run without at least putting some kind of resolution on the love triangle, though it's also likely it won't be what fans expect. Almost 100% guarantee that it won't be what fans want, which is to never see Paul again. When I think of characters that have been introduced recently that I really, really disliked, I really disliked the Batman Who Laughs, but I must admit, at least initially, there was a coolness to it. He was just way overused, way too fast, and became an enormous put-off, and now he's probably my most hated villain of all times at DC Comics. That's how much I dislike the Batman Who Laughs, but at least there was a moment in time when he wasn't terrible. Jenica within TMNT, self-insert character for Josie Campbell, but they'd already done something similar to that, with Venus de Milo, which is also rejected, did not work in cartoons and stuff like that. So it wasn't exactly an original idea, but my goodness. Paul isn't a hero. He's not a villain. He is just one of the most loathsome additions to any roster of supporting characters ever seen in a comic book. Like, I'm failing to come up with a name of a character that's been introduced that was so useless, so pointless, that only, not really divided fans, because I think everyone agrees Paul sucks so bad, but just made fans want to stop reading it. Now, Zeb Wells was at least smart enough to mostly remove Paul from his Amazing Spider-Man run, but my goodness, Paul will be on Zeb Wells' resume from here to fucking eternity. That's how useless that fucking character is. And I almost forgot about Jackpot with MJ. Making her Jackpot was so stupid. It was something that was supposed to happen back in the day. They were smart enough not to do it, and then he throws it in there. And do not read any of the Jackpot stuff. It all sucks. And I don't think there's one thing that Zeb Wells has done during his ASM run that will be looked upon fondly. The one thing he had done was that Tombstone story arc, but he basically ruined that, with the assassination attempt and then gang war and then probably with whatever he does at the end. I guess there is the opportunity. There's the hope that maybe he could salvage Tombstone, and there will be one thing Spider-Man fans can talk about when this is all said and done. Be like, you know what? I don't like Zeb Wells' run, but his Tombstone stuff was cool. Maybe he's got one of the best Tombstone stories of all time. I don't believe that. I don't think we're going to get that in the end, but we haven't seen it yet. But he is basically fucked up every other thing that he's done in Amazing Spider-Man. He messed up the big mystery. He messed up the MJ Peter Parker relationship. He messed up the Peter Parker Aunt May relationship. He messed up Chasm. He messed up Spider-Man Gang War. He messed up so much stuff. And it's just, what an enormous waste of time. And, and maybe the biggest sin of all this is John Romita Jr., while he's certainly not still in his prime, he probably has only a finite amount of time to be drawing comic books at a level to where he can continue doing an ongoing series. And he fucking wasted John Romita Jr.'s return to Amazing Spider-Man. While it was never going to look great, he could have had a great story, and people really could have enjoyed it and remembered John Romita Jr. for that last Spider-Man run as well, rather than being forced to forget it and having to remind themselves that it wasn't John Romita's fault, even though he was there. It was all Zeb Wells and Nick Lowe's fault. But this is exciting stuff. It should last, I imagine, through the end of the year. We probably get another Amazing Spider-Man reboot around January timeframe. I assume this last story arc is going to last about 6 issues, maybe 8, so 3 to 4 months. So once we get there, and it'll all be wrapped up, and Amazing Spider-Man by Zeb Wells will finally be over, and I will be happy, and you will be happy, and hopefully Marvel Comics will actually be able to get their hands on a good writer, or at least identify a young up-and-coming writer that can actually do an Amazing Spider-Man run. Do not put Steve Fox on this. Do not put Jackson Lanzing and Colin Kelly on this. Do not put Christopher Can't Write Well. Basically, go against all of your instincts as Marvel Comics editorial to put the worst, stupidest writer on this book and actually get someone talented. Hopefully, somebody is available. If you can, go get Nick Spencer. Bring him back and let him undo one more day like he originally planned to and get Peter Parker and MJ back together, at least engaged, because that's what we were all waiting for when he decided to go to Substack, and then Nick Lowe and Zeb Wells burnt all of that to the ground for no reason whatsoever other than to tarnish their own reputations. We are definitely going to be talking about this more on Thing Critical Patreon, especially. If you haven't checked that out, we have awesome conversations in the form of podcasts, most of them over 2 hours long. If you haven't checked it out and you want to support the channel, there's a link in the video description to Thinking Critical Patreon.